And the instructors are only teaching conceptual knowing. I think there's a big gap in what happens when a person graduates from a program and now starts to sit with clients. There's this like feeling of like lostness and imposter because this like essential piece and this essential component wasn't honored as important for what they're doing with their clients. And so what ends up happening is that the paradigm of therapist as expert really inhibits the field of counseling itself, meaning that when I hold space for clients, I'm not the expert in the room. I'm a whole human being. And I honor my clients as the expert of their own healing, of their own life, of their own sense of self.
This is Unconditioning, Discovering the Voice Within, with Whitney Ann Jenkins. Hello and welcome to the 112th episode of Unconditioning, Discovering the Voice Within, where I bring on guests and we talk about the inner authentic voice and the challenges and the rewards that come from following it. This episode, I have with me Harmony Kwiker. She is a psychotherapist, an author, and visiting instructor at Naropa University, where she teaches mindfulness-based transpersonal counseling. She is the founder of the Institute for Spiritual Alignment, where she offers holistic trainings for therapists, coaches, and healers. Her first book, Reveal, Embody the True Self Beyond Trauma and Conditioning, is a vulnerable self-help memoir, and her second book, Align, Living and Loving from the True Self. Her third book, The Awakened Therapist, Spirituality, Consciousness, and Subtle Energy in Gestalt Therapy, is a textbook. And her fourth book, Holistic Co-Regulation, A Practitioner's Guide to Working with Chronic Dysregulation, is also now available. I had a really interesting chat with Harmony, and we talked a lot about coming into therapy as a whole person instead of having the power dynamics of someone feeling like they are the expert in the room, because we all are sharing this human experience together. And so we dive into a lot of those topics, and I think you'll find a lot of wisdom in this episode. So here is my conversation with Harmony. Enjoy.
Transmissions and really seeing insight into why I'm here. And, oftentimes when I tell that story, because I had such a strong connection to my innate wisdom and my innate sense of spirituality from such a young age, it might seem like it was easy going from there. But it wasn't. It was an anchor point that was a really beautiful guide to come back to over and over again.
Yeah. And so where did you grow up? What was your environment like?
I grew up in California in Sacramento. Um, yeah, and my mom led a lot of workshops, and so I grew up just really seeing people arrive in our house feeling sort of disheveled and collapsed, and then doing a breathwork session with my mom and leaving more like alive and clear and sparkly. And that was actually when I realized that I could see subtle energy, that I had the gift of seeing. And yeah, and so workshops would happen in our home, and sometimes I'd participate in them. I did a fire walk when I was 7. Um, yeah. Yeah, and there was a lot of beauty to that, but there was also a lot of lack of boundaries and not just a tremendous amount of safety always. So there was um, learning for sure that was happening for me on all sorts of levels.
Right, yeah. So also, because you were immersed in that environment, how were you able to recognize your own voice within that openness?
Mm-hmm. That was a long time coming. Like most teens, I sort of shut down and closed off and created a bunch of protective mechanisms and tried to fit in. I really, really always wanted to be normal. my mom was bisexual, and this was in the 80s. And so there was just, we'd go to San Francisco a lot and hang out at the Castro. And I just wanted to be normal and like look normal. It was very much that like teenager in me that was that was my rebellion, where a lot of teenagers rebel in the opposite direction. Uh,
Yeah. What was your definition of being normal then?
oh, I mean, it was the 80s, so it was like preppy. Like I just like, wanted to just look preppy. That was like my fitting in back then. And in that, I became very quiet because I had strong intuition and I could see things. I didn't want to cause any waves. I just wanted everything to feel safe and stable because there wasn't a tremendous amount of stability. Um, and so, I think in my early 20s, I started teaching yoga and I was going through deep suffering. I had developed a lot of behaviors that were unkind to myself, eating disorders and self-betrayal and other patterns. And in my yoga practice, I just decided to let go of anything that distracted me from myself. So I let go of all substances. I had no TV. Luckily, back then we didn't have smartphones or social media. And I would sit in meditation for 2 to 3 hours a day. I was in undergrad studying psychology and English, and I was working at the yoga studio and I was teaching yoga. And there was this very intense solar eclipse on the summer solstice. This was like in early 2000. I can't remember exactly what year, but I sort of collapsed and surrendered to my suffering and recommitted to my practices and recommitted to my practices. And the next day I woke up and I had this awakening where the clarity and the transmission, like I had unlocked something, like and some barrier to my listening, just sort of, it was like a cork popped kind of, and I was just, all of the transmissions were flowing through me. And I mean, it was so obvious to everybody in my life too, that like I had reconnected to my true nature, my essential self. My dad looked at me. I remember he looked at me and he's like, "You look like an angel. You are glowing." I was just so glowing. And I sold all of my things and sort of like went on this journey to try to really discover my voice. To answer your question about how I found my voice and all of that, um, I I started writing, and that was really a way for me to cultivate my specific voice because I am a very practical person. I am very much in this world. I'm a Capricorn. Like I want my spirituality to have practical use that serves humanity and serves planetary restoration. So, um, yeah, so I really cultivated my voice in that way, sort of on my own in my practices.
Yeah. So you had an interest in psychology as well. So how did that come into play?
Such a good question. Oh, it was interesting for me because I had access to all of these really transpersonal and transcendent experiences. And when I was suffering, I would seek out counseling, and I was so dissatisfied. I felt reduced down to my symptoms. I felt like they couldn't see my wisdom, that there was something wrong with me, that I was broken. And I was so confused why the field of counseling was the place where most people sought out healing. Because I left there feeling worse. And so, there's a point at which, especially if you're coming from an educated family, that you're like, there's assumption that you're going to go on and get more education. And so I was like getting ready to leave the house, and there was this assumption that I would continue on with my education. And I was sort of going through the motions just to sort of not have to grow up, probably, like just to bide myself some time to figure out my life. And I was in junior college actually, because that's how like my commitment didn't feel that very strong. And I had to choose a major, and the only thing that seemed interesting to me was psychology. And I decided that I just wanted to understand what the gap was. Like, where was this gap in care and what was being taught? and why. And in all transparency, I finished that degree and I didn't know that you needed to get a graduate degree to actually have a career as a counselor. I just nobody had said that to me. So I this was like right when the internet was really starting to take off, and wanted to find a spiritual counseling program. I knew that that was important to me, but I wasn't sure how to find one. And I took my time and I actually started writing my first book that I never published. And I found my way to the Pacific Northwest, and I ended up finding a school that had a strong history in social justice, which was also a value that I have, and they had a spiritual psychology program. And again, in all transparency, I was still very dissatisfied at what was being taught. I was really trying to understand why psychology and counseling was being taught in this particular way, given that the human spirit knows what it is that an individual needs to heal, and that affirming a client's connection to their own innate wisdom is actually where healing is going to transpire.
Yeah.
So after I graduated, I spent a lot of time cultivating my own authentic way of being a therapist and being a counselor. I'm getting ahead of myself here, Whitney, but eventually I've published several books. I have a book coming out for counselors this month, and I teach at Naropa University now. And so I train counselors in how to honor their intuition, develop and cultivate their subtle sensitivities, and listen to their clients' innate spirituality and innate wisdom as the guide for their healing. And it's so satisfying for me. Like my younger self is like, yes, you
Yeah.
did this thing, you did it.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you mind like discussing maybe the program that you went through with the spiritual psychology and just explaining the elements that you thought were missing from that experience?
Yeah, my sort of dissatisfaction really comes from there's a lot of conceptual knowing. Like there's a lot of conceptual knowledge being taught. And, a lot of it is based in Buddhism and Taoism, which the therapeutic approach that I use is also, and I find that beautiful. But when the theoretical and clinical application is taught from conceptual knowing, the therapist's awareness-based knowing and access to the transpersonal realm and higher dimensions is not honored as essential to the therapeutic process. And I really do believe that the therapist's state of consciousness that they're holding space from matters. And I think that that is missing so much from the field of counseling, which is why I titled my book The Awakened Therapist, because the therapist's state of consciousness matters.
Oh yeah. Oh, I agree with that so much. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and I'm actually getting my PhD in psychology right now. And I didn't go down the therapeutic route just because I have very similar feelings as you do, and it's like more research based. So I don't want to
Mhm.
like go down that rabbit hole, but I am on the same page.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think research is valuable. I participate in research. I'm starting to cultivate research too. There is value in conceptual knowing, but when a person is in a clinical training program and the instructors are only teaching conceptual knowing, I think there's a big gap in what happens when a person graduates from a program and now starts to sit with clients. There's this like feeling of like lostness and imposter, because this like essential piece and this essential component wasn't honored as important for what they're doing with their clients. And so what ends up happening is that the paradigm of therapist as expert really inhibits the field of counseling itself, meaning that when I hold space for clients, I'm not the expert in the room. I'm a whole human being. And I honor my clients as the expert of their own healing, of their own life, of their own sense of self.
Yeah, yeah. So how did your life change when you began to put all of these pieces together and writing books and finding your voice in that way.
Oh, my first book, I was thinking about it this morning. It just wanted to come through me. I did not want to write that, but like I personality harmony and my ego did not want to write that book. It was so vulnerable and humbling. It's a self-help memoir where I share all the sort of dark secrets of my own history, but I really use my story as a way to highlight the journey of healing. Like for people who learn through stories, they can sort of learn through my story. And it was interesting because in my early 20s, when I had that awakening, I was really trying to write a book. I tried so hard, like like Capricorn hard, you know. And it just was not, it just wasn't like ready. I wasn't ready. And then I tried to submit it to a publishing house. Well, I submitted it to a publishing house, and the acquisitions editor suggested that I write a memoir instead because in my bio, she sort of liked my story. And I was like, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm an expert. I was still in that old paradigm as like, I'm the expert. I'm not a whole being. And so that was really where it started to shift for me. I put the book down, and it was exactly 2 years later. I was just walking my dog by the creek, and I had this transmission where I could just see the first paragraph of my book. It just boop, arrived in my awareness, and I came home, and it took me 2 years to write the memoir. And I also needed, to go through a divorce and a reclamation of me as a powerful woman with an opinion and a sense of self and desire. And yeah, and so my book was really sort of like the unveiling of that. Excuse me. It's titled Reveal, Embody the True Self Beyond Trauma and Conditioning. Because that was sort of what I was doing as I was revealing all of that as I wrote that book. Yeah, and soon thereafter, that is when I started teaching graduate school after that book came out. I mean, I think probably like 3 weeks after that book came out, I was offered a position. And then my second book came out, which is a self-help book. And it's more, it's the way that I write is, as I was saying before, in terms of teaching, is that conceptual knowing is important, but experiential knowing is also important. And so are stories. So every book I write, even the textbook that's coming out soon, has conceptual knowing, stories from my personal life, and then experientials to sort of bring the whole learning to life.
Yeah, I love that. Let's see.
Mhm.
How did you learn to implement boundaries into your life growing up in an environment in which you did?
Mhm, mhm. Well, I didn't learn how to do boundaries when I was younger. It's interesting to me now because my students will say to me, like, I love how boundaried you are, Harmony. And it's an interesting reflection because at this point in my life, it really is easy for me to know what I want, what other people think, and where we're meeting in that in-between dimension. And let's see, the how of how I did it. I sort of threw myself into a relational practice that is based in integral theory. And it's no longer in existence here in Boulder, Colorado, but it was called the Integral Center. And there's this authentic relating practice called circling. Have you heard of it?
I've heard of it, but for the
Okay.
listeners, for the sake of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And so circling is actually very similar to Gestalt therapy, which is what I practice and teach at Naropa. And so I realized when I entered into this community how inept I was at being in relationship. And it was such a like really beautiful way for me to practice in community intentionally in a way that wasn't with like my primary partner, where the stakes were higher, and I was single at the time too. So it was very it was very liberating for me to be in a community with people who valued authenticity, uh, and sort of thinking outside the box. And, so yeah, because I was bad at it, I really worked hard at it, that same sort of way that I move in the world. And yeah, and it was really fun and liberating. And so what happened for me in that practice was I realized that to hold boundaries while in relationship with another person requires that I know what it is that I want. I need to know how I feel as a separate person. I need to know what I think and what I value. And so that means I need to have a strong sense of myself. And simultaneously, I need to be curious about other people and what they want and what they think and what they value and how they feel. And that is where the relational meeting point is. And in Gestalt therapy, we talk about the contact boundary. I think when people hear the word boundary, they think of a wall or a barrier to keep people out. But in truth, it's really a meeting point between ourselves and the environment. And if I'm really in touch with myself, I don't need a wall to keep people out. People can be who people are, and I get to be who I am, and that is the boundary.
Yeah, excellent. And it seems like you're able to be aware, like your inner voices, like guiding you to look at what you're having difficulty with to address that and explore it further. It seems to be something that helped you along the way.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, my energy practices are extremely important in that, meaning as a sensitive being who can hear other people's thoughts and feel what other people are feeling and can sense things before they happen and dream them before they happen and dream them into existence. Um, it's I daily, twice a day, sometimes three times a day, if I'm teaching long days, I have practices where I ask my guides and my helpers, and I really connect with the fairies, to support me in clearing my energy of other people's thoughts, emotions, projections, um, desires, so that I can actually feel the truth of who I am separate from them. Because if I'm unaware and other people's energy start getting into my system, then I stop feeling like myself and I don't know why. And so I'm very committed to those practices to stay connected to myself.
Yeah, excellent. Because you work with students, how have you witnessed this philosophy with them and how they receive it?
Yeah, it's so delightful to me because my students are there to learn how to become counselors. And inevitably, they always tell me that they learn how to be more of who they learn to be more of themselves in the world because of being in my class. Because to be a Gestalt therapist, it's really an embodied state of being. It's not a technique that we employ. It's an intuitive system of psychotherapy. And yeah, and so I find that my students are so grateful to be able to have an educational sort of space to learn, similar to what I was saying about the Integral Center, like this space where it's not with their primary partner or their children or their parents, and to be in community that shares that value and to really learn how to speak on behalf of their truth, how to access their intuition in the classroom, in the therapy room, and to feel more alive and more connected to their true self in their work in the world.
Yeah, and I feel like this is a really important time for people to be exploring those aspects of themselves. So where
Mhm.
do you envision, because you released your book, The Awakened Therapist, and I feel like that is also a comment on perhaps like where society is.
Mhm.
So where do you envision or hope that things go for you, and the collective going further?
I want to make sure I understand the question. So, like, what is my prayer for the world? Or,
Yeah, kind of.
yeah, I really hope that, I mean, I believe that individual healing and transformation is the way to create collective change, that the external world really is a reflection of internal suffering, and that the more whole and alive and loving people are with themselves and with their pain, the more that is reflected out into the world around us. And so my hope is that that there are, as I was saying before, that most people look to psychotherapy as the place to go for healing. And so my hope is that there's more places in the field of psychotherapy where people can really have access to quality quality counseling that supports their deepest transformation and return to their spiritual self.
Yeah. I've been noticing a trend on social media lately of sort of like a pop psychology thing, very specifically in regards to like narcissism and
Mhm.
borderline personality disorder and things like that.
Mhm.
What is your take on why that is coming to surface and like what that is really all about?
Whitney, I was literally thinking about this as I was coming to sit here with you. I'm not even joking. I was pondering the same thing. And I ultimately think that it's like a positive movement and a paradigm shift where if we look back historically, um, where, there was this uh, pejorative way that women were reduced down to being hysterical or crazy, as opposed to looking at like, and in what context are they becoming hysterical and crazy? And, in my field, in transpersonal counseling, we do not pathologize. We prioritize process over pathology. And yet there is value in understanding certain diagnostic criteria. This is sort of getting off of your question a little bit, but I'm headed there. And so I think that there's a positive notion in people talking about narcissism specifically and understanding that it is a diagnosis that is reserved for mostly men, and that it is a problem that we've been ignoring, and that misuse of power that comes specifically with white men in power positions who might meet the criteria of narcissism, like being able to see them accurately is actually really important. There's a lot of value there. Of course, with any new movement, there is a tendency to overuse a term, especially when you're not trained in understanding the fullness of the diagnostic criteria and its expression. Um, However, I really think that it's like a bigger sort of like, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like I don't know, it's like a bigger projector of what's happening deeper within the collective, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I was kind of feeling the same way, but also as you were talking about like not like pathologizing things.
Mhm.
Um, yes, like that might be a problem, but our society has kind of like helped that become a problem. Um,
Mhm.
that's really interesting to me because if you just reduce people to their symptoms, then that's not really looking at the whole person or the
Mhm.
whole problem either.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I just wrote an article the other day titled "Humanizing Narcissistic Personality Disorder" because yeah. because I work with clients who meet the criteria for NPD, and there is like a lot of fear and insecurity and lack of skill, and um, you know that is beneath those patterns. And when you consider so for me, I consider all behavior an expression of an adaptive survival strategy, and I do see narcissistic personality disorder as an adaptive attempt at fitting into the system that was not designed for the person's well-being. Because if they had been held in a family system that was designed for their well-being, they wouldn't have created a personality that was so off balance from their heart and from their spirit and from, their deeper knowing. So yeah, I mean, yeah. So I do think there's value though in people having knowledge and talking about narcissism. It's really language is so interesting. I remember when I was in graduate school, I was so upset at people being hyper identified with their diagnoses, like I'm bipolar, as opposed to I have bipolar, or he's narcissistic, as opposed to he seems to have characteristics of narcissism. You know, just the language itself can
Right.
shift so much.
Right, especially when you consider like even the theme of this podcast about unconditioning and like getting to that authentic place of yourself. When you identify with a disorder, then that becomes part of your authenticity in a way.
Well, it's part of your hyper identified self. And if you move in the world by way of your hyper identified self, you're not moving from your wholeness. But the thing that I think is so just like endearing about humanity is that our personality and our conditioned self is pretty persistent. Like once you know the map, you know the map. It's not changing. Love that about us.
The map going forward, what do you hope to do with your own work
Mm.
as far as all of these things that we're talking about?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I am getting ready to launch a year-long program, like a live training for therapists, the Awakened Therapist training. Um, and I feel nervous in my stomach, even just saying it out loud, because I'm at the beginning of the developing of it, but I can feel that that's the movement that I'm headed in with my book as the curriculum. I love teaching therapists and working with student therapists. It's um, really truly magnificent to me to see this like amplification of consciousness through the learning of transpersonal counseling, really. um and so yeah, I'm just getting ready to do my book launch right now, and I hope to support and empower more therapists in accessing their intuition and listening to their spiritual intelligence as the guide for their work.
Yeah, and if there are any therapists listening, or anyone else actually, who would like to look and find your work, where can we guide them to?
Yeah, my website is thespirituallyaligned.com. And I have a lot of resources on that website for you, articles. I just launched a podcast, the Awakened Therapist podcast. And yeah, yeah, reach out.
Yeah, great. Is there anything on the top of your mind or your heart that you feel like you would really love to share?
Mm. Yeah, I just would love to share that in modern existence, it might seem like coming back home to oneself isn't enough. And I want to say that it is. It really is. Like being seated in your heart, listening to your deeper truth, updating old patterns, and like getting really current and embodying your wise self it matters. You matter. Yeah. Every one of us.
Excellent. And so I usually have one last question to wrap up the conversation. And that is, if your inner voice had a billboard, what would it say to the world?
Hmm. Slow down. Yeah, I really believe the only place to get is more in touch with what's right here. And it's really common for people to not know if they're hearing their intuition or their fear.
Mm.
And really just slowing down and getting more and more in touch with what's right here, the truth will reveal itself.
Mm. I love that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your wisdom. I've really enjoyed this very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you so much for joining me this week. If you're listening and you like what you hear, please consider subscribing and rating this podcast, as it really helps get this podcast out to other people who might be interested in hearing it but don't know about it yet. And also, if you'd like to contact me or reach me, you can reach me at unconditioningpodcast@gmail.com or unconditioningpodcast on Instagram. Thank you so much. And until next time, stay tuned in to you.